I'm very glad to introduce you and to give the floor to our great speaker and our key speaker today, Raymond Murphy.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming. Can everyone hear me? I'm not used to microphones, but this one is attached to me, so there's a good chance that I will not walk away from it, because I tend to walk away from it. But anyway, we should be okay today. Okay, it's a great experience for me to come here, and I'm not just saying that to be polite. It's because travelling to other countries, not just other countries, but to other places, is a wonderful experience. And to come to places which are a little bit, from my perspective, off the beaten track, not the places that people normally visit, not Moscow, Petersburg, or cruises on the river, but just to come to a town that I'd never heard of, actually, before I knew I was coming here. All right? So I like going to places which are not the main places in countries. So it's nice, because on the rest of this trip is St. Petersburg and Moscow. I've been to St. Petersburg, and I'm going to Moscow tomorrow. So it's really a nice experience to come to somewhere else, and somewhere a bit different, and somewhere I'd never heard of before. Okay, I'd like, I'll begin just by telling you a little bit about myself, so that you know a little bit about me and my past, and then I'll explain what I'm going to talk about a little bit, and then I'll talk about it. So, a long time ago, I was a teacher of English as a foreign language, and I understand that most of you, if not all of you, are also teachers of English. My experience of teaching is probably a little bit different from yours, and I think we have to bear that in mind. When I start talking, I'm talking from my own experience, and you will have a different experience probably. So my experience, first of all, it was a long time ago. I stopped teaching in about 1990, that's 25 years ago, having taught for about 15, 16, 17 years, something like that. So that was a long time ago, so I'm not in any condition to teach anybody anything anymore. I stopped teaching because I had the opportunity to stop teaching. I mean, there are advantages in having a more flexible lifestyle, maybe. So, and it's just continued, and the books have been successful, so I was able not to do that, not to teach. So anyway, that was my teaching experience, and it was in language schools. In Germany, initially, for 3 years. That was in the 1970s. And then in the UK for approximately 10 years, no, not 10, that's 15 years, in a language school in Oxford, which is the place where I live in the UK. And I worked in this language school for 15 years, and the classes were usually quite small, say about 12 people in a class, and they were adults. And so they were probably, in most cases, motivated, and the courses were intensive. When you're teaching in a school, when you're teaching kids in a school, learning English is part of education, it's part of growing up. It's not intensive, it's part of the timetable, part of the curriculum. In my case, it was intensive. People were coming to a language school to learn English, and they were coming to a language school in Britain, in England, to learn English. Maybe just for 2 weeks, maybe for a year, it varied. But anyway, it was very intensive. And most importantly, it was international. So the students that I taught came from places all over the world. Because I stopped in 1990, all over the world I had to qualify that, because before 1990 we didn't get students from Russia. And so I never taught Russian students. I have never taught in my life, in fact, as far as I can remember, a Russian student. But they did come from lots of different countries with lots of different languages. Okay, so Arab-speaking students, Arabic-speaking students from Arab countries, people from South America, people from East Asia, from Japan, from Korea, from China, and so on, from all over Europe, some parts of Africa. So they came from different countries, had different backgrounds, and obviously the medium of teaching was English. So I was teaching only in English. There's no other possibility, because you have a mixture of languages, and I couldn't speak those languages anyway. So the teaching was in English, just the same as the books are in English, written in English, for people learning English. Right. So that's my teaching background. When I started writing these books developed from my working with students that I taught. And I was writing these books for the students I taught. That means it happened to be intermediate level, right? But coming from lots and lots of different countries. And I wanted to write something really for a learner who hasn't yet learned English, somebody who is in the process of learning English. So in that situation, it's pretty difficult to read, a text which is written for people who know the language. I wanted to write something simple, something uncomplicated, that a learner could manage. And I was thinking of these people that I taught when I wrote. I was trying to write for real people, not for an abstract idea, like the intermediate learner, the concept. I was trying to write for, Hans from Germany and Abdullah from Saudi Arabia, and they were all in my head. Those were the people I wrote for. Maybe only about 20 people, but they were representing, the rest of the world. So, when I started writing, I wanted to write simply. And I'm going to talk a little bit about terminology today, language terminology. I will say things which are from my experience and that they're my opinions, and they're very much from the point of view of my teaching experience and writing experience using English as the medium of instruction. You are in a different situation. You may use English, or you may use Russian, or a mixture, or something, but you're in a different situation to that. You may not agree with things I say, but they're things which interest me, and they're the things I can talk about. I can't talk about how to teach English to children in Russia, because I don't know how to teach English to children in Russia, but I do have ideas and thoughts about what I've done, and I'd like to share those with you. So, let's go. That's the title of the talk, Let the Language Speak for Itself. So, terminology. Terminology. Is there a Russian word like that? Terminologia or something? Yes? Oh, good. Terminology. Long words are often the easiest. If you speak a European language, we share all these sort of technical words. Not all of them, but some of them anyway. I've just said that I was trying to write something quite simple. And I recently looked at my books again. The red book, Essential Grammar Use, the blue book, English Grammar Use. And I just looked through them to see how much terminology, grammatical terminology, do I in fact use. And I was quite surprised because there's quite a lot. This is, in this slide, these are some terms which I use fairly automatically. In other words, I use them in the book and I don't always explain what they mean. I expect people to know them, more or less. So, present, past, future, noun, verb, adjective, adverb, preposition, singular, plural, sentence, structure, word order, expression, like a phrase. Use that phrase. These are terms that I use in the book, and I sort of expect learners to know them. And these are examples of terms that I use in the book, but I would explain them in the unit. I would explain what I meant by this term. Examples are tense names here. Present simple, simple present if you prefer. I don't realise why you can say simple present or present simple, but apparently you can. Past continuous, but not the continuous past. Comparative, superlative, clause, relative clause, subject, object, direct speech, reported speech, active, passive, countable, uncountable. These are, for me, fairly technical terms. They're not terms which mean much to people unless they've studied language or learnt language in a fairly formal way. So I would use these terms, but always explain what they are, or make it clear what I mean by them. For example, instead of just saying comparative, bracket, bigger, more important, etc., something like that. But I still thought there was quite a lot of terminology in it, because I'd like there to be no terminology in an ideal world, but that's what there is. And I think probably it's okay, because I was writing for, as I said, Abdullah from Saudi Arabia, and Hans from Germany, and Keiko from Japan, and I think they were okay with this. I think maybe Abdullah not, because they don't have such a tradition. But Keiko and Hans would have been okay with it, I think. All right? So that's the terminology that is in English grammar and use. And what I want to look at now is some terminology which is not in English grammar and use, or at least most of it isn't in English grammar and use, but I have something to say about these terms. I'll just fill my glass while you're looking at that. So, unhappy terminology. You can't really see the board, but the present participle. It's a quite a common grammatical term. You find it in a lot of grammar books and grammars. And there we are in that sentence. They were waiting for me when I arrived. Waiting is the present participle, and we call this the present participle. Participle just means a little word, and we don't know what to call it, so we call it a participle. So present participle, you would expect to be something to do with the present. But they were waiting for me when I arrived is clearly not to do with the present. This is the past. So already we're using a term like present participle for something which is not necessarily present. It doesn't seem like a good choice of names. Maybe whoever started this, I don't know, it probably comes from Latin grammar originally, had the best of intentions, and maybe there were reasons for doing it, but I think now that's a pretty useless term. I would always use just ing or ing. You may be unhappy with calling something ing, it's not a very technical name, but I use ing to represent that ing ending. So if I had to talk about this, I don't think I ever have talked about it, but if I had to talk about this, I would say we use ing with this word. But in writing, I would say, for example, the past continuous tense is was, were, ing, rather than the past continuous tense is was, were, plus the present participle. Anyway, I think that's one we can avoid, present participle. Is that a term that you would translate into Russian if you used it, or would you use the English term if you were using it? You would use the English term. Even in a Russian sentence, you say, we use the present participle.
Usually we say in.
Oh, yeah.
If we have to, we use English.
Yeah, I know you use it, yeah, don't worry. I believe you. Yeah. But you do use sometimes the English word rather than translate present participle. The second one here is the past participle. And we have a similar problem. I mean the other way round. How is this word used? Used is the past participle. And the sentence is not past. It's present or general, whatever you want to call it. How is this word used? So we're not talking about the past, but we're using the term past participle. However, it is more difficult to find another name for past participle. If you come up with a good one, I'd be interested to know. Some people have called it the ED participle, but that's not very good because ED is like the past simple tense as well. And in any case, many verbs are irregular. So there's no easy way to replace past participle. So I continue to use it in writing. I don't think I'd use it if I was speaking to a class, but I use it in my book, but only, to show how a form is made. So I might say the present perfect is have plus past participle. Fire somewhere else, is it? Okay, so past participle, although it's equally bad as a description, I use it in moderation in the book. You will find it in present perfect, just to show the structure as a present perfect. Anyway, that's unhappy. This is unnecessary, in my opinion. The definite article. What is a definite article? A definite article is the. Why do we need to say anything more about it? Because the is the. There's no need really to give it a name or an explanation. I'm talking now about teaching, I'm talking about learning. I'm talking about learners learning. I'm not talking about you and me having a conversation about this, okay? If we're interested in language or we're talking about grammar, yeah, of course we say, we use the article in this way, the definite article in this way. That's our way of talking. We're talking about the language. We're not learning the language, we're talking about it. And that's fine, we're talking about it. But I'm not talking about that situation, I'm talking about learning a language which is not the same thing. In that case, I don't see any value in finding a name for the. The definite article even includes the word the. Right. The is always the, although that's, of course, in speech it's the or the, because the already before a vowel, but let's forget that for a moment. It's one word, so why go to the trouble of defining it if you're, for your learners? There's a nice word, conditional. Conditional. What we mean usually when we're talking about conditional or conditionals in English is if clauses, if sentences, if you like. I don't see any value in the term conditional. We don't have a special word for, or we do have a special word for clauses of reason or something, or clauses of concession, but we don't use those very much, certainly not for learners. So conditional, I would abolish that term personally if I had the power. I don't like it. It's also there's also a lot of complex terms including the word conditional. People talk about the first conditional, the second, and the third conditional. I don't know who invented that. It might be. I don't want to say it's necessarily bad either, because I'm sure if it was some sort of teacher at some point, he was thinking of being helpful, to divide it up, to break it up, to make it manageable, and all those are good things. And I can see that makes some sense. But it doesn't quite work, first, second and third conditional, and people keep on finding new ones. Don't know what to call them. 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th. I've got 7. I don't know if anyone's got 8 or 9. I think I could argue for 7 conditionals, which is clearly ridiculous. Because really there's only one, and that's if. Let's look at some sentences. If it rains, water comes in through the roof. That is, I'm told, what some people call a zero conditional. Is that right? So somebody said this first conditional, second conditional, third conditional. They said, we've found another one, but this one we've just found is in fact the most basic one. So we can't call it the 4th conditional because that suggests it's the last one. Because really it should be the first one. So we call it zero conditional. Yeah. And then if you find another one, you have to call it -1. It's an abuse of mathematics. So if it rains, okay, traditionally, it seems that the first one, if it rains, water comes in through the roof, is what some people call zero conditional. If it rains, water will come in through the roof, is what most people maybe call the first conditional. Meaning's very similar, but one is general and one is more specific, talking about a specific event, possible event. I put in brackets not will rain because that is a useful thing to point out to your learners if they use typically in the corresponding sentence in their language, if they use a future, they might want to put it in there. We don't use a future or will after if in the same way. So that's something that needs to be pointed out to learners. But that's a separate point really. So we've got those two. And then next one, if you're tired, why don't you go to bed? This is somebody saying, oh, I'm tired, oh God, life's terrible, oh, I'm tired. And you say, well, if you're tired, why don't you go to bed? If you are tired, why don't you go to bed? Is that first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth conditional? Is it? It's not the first, is it? Sorry, it's not the zero one. So, is it the first one? Or is it the zero one? I don't really know what the zero one is. All I know is that that is a simple sentence with if. The same as you have a simple sentence with because. For example, if you said, I went to bed because I was tired, or I am going to bed because I am tired. These are normal tenses, normal in English. But we can say, for an intermediate learner, that these are not problems. Probably. All right? So, if you're tired, why don't you go to bed? It is no more a problem than saying, I went to bed because I was tired. We don't have to focus on that particularly. You have to know the word if. And I think Russian has a word if, which corresponds pretty closely to the if in English. So it's not a problem. The second one, if you were tired last night, okay, why didn't you go to bed? So somebody says, I was very, very tired last night. I forgot to go to bed, so I'm still tired now. All right? And you say, well, if you were tired, why didn't you go to bed, fool? Yeah. Why? What's that? If you were tired. It's not if the weather were better, is it? It's not so-called second conditional. It's normal tenses. Normal conditional. If you were tired, why didn't you go to bed? And the third one. The situation here is, I'm talking to my friend, and my friend said, Jane didn't phone me yesterday. I'm worried, etc., etc. Don't worry. If she didn't call you yesterday, I think she'll call you later today. If she didn't call you yesterday, I think she'll call you later today. Again, These are normal tenses. She didn't call you yesterday. I think she'll call you later today. The underlying meaning is, if it is a fact that she didn't call you yesterday, I think she will call you later today. So I don't know how you want to classify those, but I see no need to classify them. These are normal sentences with if, in the same way as you have normal sentences with because, or until, or when. Just that little problem at the beginning. So that's normal will, and then you get funny will, and funny will, funny in the sense of strange. Strange will, weird will, is when we're talking about unreal or unlikely things. Like, you know, if I were you, I'd do something. If the weather were better, I'd do something. Or if I won a lot of money, I'd do something. If something hadn't happened, something else would have happened. All that. These are the strange ones, if you like. The ones which are unreal and use the past tenses, but not for the past necessarily. So I think you divide into normal and not normal. And that's better than saying first, second, third, mixed, zero, any other conditionals, because I don't think that does anything for the learner. You may disagree, a lot of people do, but that's my feeling about it. So I've mentioned definite article conditionals, and there's another one. Third person singular. So you've got a student who makes an error in the present simple, and doing an exercise maybe, and how to put the verb in the right form, and the verb is love, and it's John loved Mary. You've got to put the word love in the right form, and he writes love. John loved Mary. And you say, what do you say? Now, what person is that? Is that first, second, or third person? Is it singular or plural? Whereas what you can say is John, or he. Emphasize the he or the John, or if it's a female, it's she. It. It, by the way, is not a person. I rest my case. So these are examples of things I believe are necessary, and even if you don't agree, it's something to think about. In general, I prefer to let the language speak for itself. He, she, if, the, rather than definite article, conditional, third person singular, and so on. Something's gone wrong with the typing there. Bullets. Anyway. Problematic terminology. Looking at infinitive here. Some terms which cause other problems. Not necessarily bad terminology, but terminology that asks questions. Infinitive. When we talk about the infinitive, do we mean work or to work? So I put two examples there. They should work harder. They ought to work harder. And are they both infinitive? Or is one of them something else? Are both of them something else? That's the question. What do we mean? Because the result is fairly different, because you have an extra word, to. Does that change anything? Well, work is sometimes called the infinitive. I call it the infinitive too. It's sometimes called the base form, and sometimes called the infinitive without to. Okay. Base form is in fact a very good description, because in English, that's what it is. That is what it is. That's its function. It's the base form. We're talking about, if you're looking at irregular verbs like write, wrote, written, we're talking about number one, write, no, you, no, no. Right. So we're talking about the first thing in the irregular verb tables. And what to call that? Is it infinitive or something else? Base form is a very good description, because work is the base form of works, working, worked, all those forms. The infinitive without to is a bit negative. you have to sort of add the two and then take it away in your head. So I think, for me, for that word, I use infinitive. I use the term infinitive, although it's a rather technical word, a Latin word, coming from Latin grammar. It's a word that a lot of learners know if their language is European. Even, I believe, in Russian you do have a term infinitive. It doesn't necessarily mean the same thing, but you do have the word. It's not unfamiliar. Infinitive, you could recognise it. So, I call it infinitive, but when I was working on the American language editions of my books, there are American English versions of my books, and I work with an American adapter and editors to produce that. Obviously we have to make certain changes. But this change was to do with terminology, because when I say we use can with the infinitive, can do, can play, can talk, etc. They said, no, that's not the infinitive, that's the base form. And I said, that's the same thing. I said, no. But work is the base form, and to work is the infinitive. And of course, a lot of people do think of the infinitive as to something, because often it goes together with to. And I was told, and I can only believe what I've been told by the Americans I work with, that in American teaching circles, in the American world of English as a second language, the norm, the orthodoxy, the usual terms used were base form for work and infinitive for to work, and they made a distinction. For me, that's ridiculous, but it's ridiculous for English. It might not be for another language, because in English, the infinitive is the same form as the base form. So there's no good reason to have two separate terms. So I think you have to choose one or the other. I talk about the infinitive, and I talk about to plus infinitive. That's my way of doing things. But either way, you have to be consistent and be aware of not being confusing. The second word there is gerund. Are you familiar with that term? Yeah. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say it, ever, in my life, gerund. It's, again, it's like the present participle. It's the same form as the present participle, of course. But it's ing. Why not just say ing, ing? At least that's what I prefer to do, ing, ing, instead of saying things like gerund or verbal noun. It's not important either to differentiate them, at least not to consciously differentiate them. So gerund is a term which for me is problematic, just because it's so technical. It's Latin. It's much more Latin than English. And of course, English grammar was written by people who were Latin scholars. These are some examples of the way I would choose to avoid terminology. In the first one, after these verbs we use to, and that means to do, to go, to. All right. In context, if the unit is about the infinitive and ing, for example, it seems to be pretty clear with the examples that to means to work, to go, to play. The second one, after some verbs you can, oops, all right. After some verbs you can use ing or to. Again, ing or to. No need to use any further words. We use can, I've just actually given you that example, we use can plus infinitive, brackets, to do, play, write, etc. So in that last example, I've clarified what I mean by infinitive, so that a student doesn't think it's to do, to play, to write. And of course, you have examples following that. Some more examples like that. Be plus past participle is used, done, broken just explains what past participle is. It doesn't explain it, but it shows what it is. The second one, compare the present perfect, have seen, and the past perfect, had seen. Just give examples. The third one, after this is a unit about in spite of, and although, something like that. In spite of or despite, we use a noun, a pronoun, or ing. And noun I'm okay with. I think most people using that unit, given what else is on the page, they will know what noun means. A pronoun, well, pronoun's a bit vague because, some is a pronoun, I is a pronoun, this is a pronoun. So it's quite good to specify what sort of pronouns occur in this structure. So examples, in spite of this, in spite of that, in spite of what I said. That's the sort of pronoun that occurs. So put those examples in. Don't just leave it as pronoun because that might be a bit mysterious. And now, some really unnecessary terminology. It's getting serious now. I have to keep repeating that this is my own personal opinion. It's not necessarily orthodox, and other people have other opinions, but this is mine. And I'm talking always about the learner learning, not about teachers talking to each other or professors talking to teachers or something. Examples that shall we go by train, not by train, the train, by train, no article. Article. See, I said article to you because you know what an article is. I don't watch TV much. Watch TV without the. Now, why do you need a term, zero article, which means something quite different from zero conditional? But zero article means there isn't an article, doesn't it? Okay? So there's an absence of article. All your poor Russian learners have been trying to put articles in, and suddenly you say there's zero article. Well, you don't need an article. It's bad news. I think, just look at this. This is something I found on the internet, which is a website for learners of English, and intermediate learners, as far as I could tell, mainly. And there was actually a section on zero article. You can Google zero article and it comes up with lots and lots of stuff. For example, this. We've seen how nouns usually have an article. The indefinite articles, or or the definite article, the. Sometimes though, there is no article associated with a noun, and this could be called the zero article. Here are some simple rules for when not to use an article. And that's on a website, and it's for learners who probably are intermediate. Let's say intermediate, maybe lower, but it was actually for learners who wanted to study more in the UK. It was a way of finding out about schools in the UK, language schools and so on. So on this website they had this section about grammar for you, or something, for the learner. So this is for learners, it wasn't for me or you, this is for learners. I mean, if you can understand that, then you've learned English, I think. So who is it addressed to? When I first wrote, I always found out about the existing grammar books in 1980, but I think also the ones that are still being written are written, they're not really written for somebody who's learning with any difficulty. They're written for people who have learned, not who are learning. So, that's the zero article. Yeah, it's, I can't see any point in talking about the zero article in learners' terms. It's, again, fine if we're talking about linguistics and things. Yeah? The term, I imagine, was relatively recent, and yeah, I could use it as a shorthand, as talking about it. It's a short way of referring to it. But I don't think it's not very good for learners. And our friend, the zero conditional, which is a completely different animal in spite of the word, because zero conditional means something else. It doesn't mean no conditional. It means something less than one. It's funny. Okay, that's terminology. And so my point there, in most cases, is if possible, I've put as much as possible because I've realised it's not always possible, past participle, for example. But generally speaking, try and let the language speak for itself. It's there, you know. You don't need long explanations and descriptions and labels. But the examples, you know, carefully chosen and carefully presented and laid out for the learner, you know, with a little bit of explanation is a much more appropriate way of doing things. I'm going to go on to something else now. Not really something else, it's a development of what I've been talking about. Together with the use of terminology, I'm concerned about the amount of complexity there is. I like to keep things as simple as possible, as few words as possible, not just the terminology, but also the concepts, the idea. Just try and reduce things down to like a skeleton. Now this example is actually nothing to do with English, because this is actually Thailand, the language. Because I have spent a lot of time in the last 7 years sort of trying to learn Thai, but not very seriously. And all I can say, it's a bit like a hobby, right? So you know, does anyone speak Thai here? Secretly? Any Thai people there? Good. So I've got this, I'm using this stuff from the internet on Thai. And it's very good. And this is an example of something I came across recently, just a month ago or so. It's like a grammar module, this was. So this is a page of a grammar module. It's like video, but it's words rather than anything else. We bought each of our kids a hat. Now that is the sentence in question, all right? And the red bit, does it look red? I can't see it. It's just my angle. Each of our kids, that's the important bit for the purposes of me learning this. And the writer of this program, and it's written in English, by the way. This is written for people who are learning through English, so they are English speakers, native or non-native, using English as the base. So the explanations, and this is like an explanation showing the structure, is in English, right? So here, I've had to spend a minute doing this, although it's nothing to do with English. In Thai, you have a word, a type of word, a class of word, that's it. A class of word, a word class, called a classifier. And a classifier is a bit like a pronoun. It stands for another word. And you use this in a lot of situations. The easiest one to think of is for counting things. So if, for example, you say, I bought 3 bananas, you'd say, a bit like this, right? I bought 3 bananas. I buy. There's no tenses in Thai, no past, no present, no future. Okay, that's good. Don't worry, they have other problems for you. So it's I buy banana. No plurals in Thai. No endings in Thai. Opposite of Russian. So what's it? I buy banana, and then 3, the number, and then this other word, which is a classifier. And that word depends on the noun it stands for. So a banana, I can't remember the classifier of banana, but there is a special word which is for bananas and maybe other things that look like bananas, or maybe things which are that size, or I don't know. There's different criteria for these classifiers, all right? If you say, I've got 3 children, it would be, I have children, or child, sorry. I have child, and then 3 classifier, and the classifier for children, which is actually the word for people, would be the other word. So you get a different word instead of repeating it, and that's how you say 3 books, 5 bananas, 100 years, and so on. You have to use these classifiers. It's quite nice when you get used to it. He said the structure is a classifier for an indirect object, plus the word for each. So the indirect object is kid, excuse me, and each comes after it, and then you go to the number, which is 1. That's not each one, okay? The 1 belongs to hat. So it's 1, as in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 1, and then the classifier for the direct object, which will be a word for hat, a word instead of hat, right? So that's the point of the lesson. Now, the guy who wrote this, in my opinion, unfortunately, used terms indirect object and direct object. Why? Why would you want to use terms indirect object and direct object in that situation? It's not telling you anything that you don't know already. I already know what a direct and indirect object is before anyone uses those words. I mean, I might not know the word direct object, but I know that the relationship between the hat and the kids. I know that he didn't buy the kids. He bought the hat. All right? You don't have to know it's an indirect object. You just have to have an idea of what's going on. Now, that really annoyed me. I thought you could have all those words, 4 long words, taken out of that just to simplify it and concentrate on this structure without talking about what kind of object it was. If you're coming from English, you don't need that. In other languages, maybe in some situations, indirect object, direct object is an important concept, and you might want to talk about it. But here, no. I certainly didn't like it and didn't want it. Here's, I think I'll leave that one, because it's just doing much the same thing. I showed you something just now about 0 article. This one came from the same website, and it's about possessive adjectives, which can also be classified as determiners. Possessive adjectives, I'm reading it, are not pronouns, but rather determiners. It is useful to learn them at the same time as pronouns, however, because they are similar in form to the possessive pronouns. Possessive adjectives function as adjectives, so they appear before the noun they modify. They do not replace a noun as pronouns do. Right, I told you about this website and that it's for learners. And we're talking about possessive adjectives, which are, as you know, my, your, his, her, their. All right. Level for learning that? Advanced? Intermediate? It's pretty low, isn't it? I mean, it comes up pretty quickly in any elementary or beginner's course. So anyone who really wants to organise their possessive adjectives is going to be a fairly low level. If they can read that, they are not of a fairly low level. I have to read that carefully. I think we all have to read that fairly carefully. It's giving a lot of irrelevant information. The language is absolutely, it's written for abstractions. It's not written for real people, for real learners. It's okay for me, it's okay for your colleagues, but it's useless for the learner. Who are these people writing for? I find that extraordinary, that anyone can write in this vacuum. This is a detail, really. Here I'm just talking about the use of certain words. We use will to make predictions. And predictions is it's not a terribly difficult concept, but you, as say an intermediate learner, perhaps will know it, perhaps not. There's a good chance that they won't know, or not sure. Well, yeah, you can look it up in a dictionary, of course. and it's a sort of word you can look up in a dictionary, get a good result usually. But why use it without any explanation? I mean, use something else, or if you want to use predict and predictions, then better to explain it in some way, all right, through a situation, not necessarily with more words. The second example we use be going to if something is likely to happen. I'm not thinking here of the quality of the explanation. You might not feel that that's a very good explanation. I'm just looking at that one word, likely. I can't remember the students I taught ever using that word. It's the sort of word that you can avoid very easily. There are other ways to say it. I think it's confusing because it looks like, and of course it's related to like, but it's got a different meaning now. So I don't think that will help most learners. Finally, I just want to look at a couple of other examples of where I would suggest something could be simpler. Now, none of these things are terrible. I'm just saying I would prefer them to be simpler. Think of it as something from a grammar book. The verbs in the list below are usually followed by the infinitive. Want, plan, decide, etc. Followed by, a few examples. Okay? I would prefer something like that. Simply a title, really, a heading. Verbs plus to, want to do, etc. And then a list of the verbs, and then examples. But just getting rid of in the list below are usually followed by the infinitive. Of course, the top one is more graceful, it's more beautifully written, in a nicer style of writing. But I find there are a lot of words there I would choose to reduce that. Another example. As a main verb, to have implies the meaning of possession. Plus examples. Implies the meaning of possession. It's a very indirect way of stating something. We get promises to say what have means, but it doesn't quite achieve that. It's a difficult word to explain. Basic things are always the most difficult things to explain, meanings. But I would suggest you could say, I've got something, means it is mine, and leave it like that. Finally, at, on, in, the time. Before different time expressions, English uses different prepositions. As examples. I would prefer that. I don't really see that you need it. We'll leave that one. So my message again is let the language speak for itself. And finally then to finish, a couple of general points about grammar I'd like to make about grammar and its status and learning grammar. The first thing is we should look at grammar as a positive thing and as an enabling thing. Grammar is what enables you to put words together. It doesn't have to be very complicated, but you have to get something right with grammar. Typically the order of words, if you're talking about English anyway, the order of words has to be right to make a message clear. And then you've got various things like endings and the correct preposition, the right tense. All these things add to it and make the message clearer and better. But let's look at grammar not as a series of rules. Not rules. I mean, rules is, can't do that, you must do this. It's the wrong word. It's an authoritarian word. It's a negative word. Whereas pattern is a much more positive word. This is what we say. You give examples. So teaching the word should or something, and you give a lot of examples of should. We should do this, we should do that, we should have done that. And presenting that as a pattern is more valid than you're making some sort of statement about it, how we use should plus, I don't know, perfect infinitive or something. So, grammar should be enabling. We should think of it as being enabling and as positive. Secondly, a thing to think about is that you can obviously learn a language without studying grammar, because that's how you learned your language. That's how lots of people learn a second language. Lots of people learn a second language without studying. Africans are the best example. Talk to Africans living in, a lot of Africans anyway, who speak 4 or 5 languages. You know, their mother tongue, their local tongue, the school tongue, and national tongue, and then English. It's wonderful. People are used to all these different things, but there's no grammar involved. I mean, there is grammar involved, but it's not studying grammar. They're learning grammar, not studying it. So we need to make that distinction. You can't speak a language without grammar, but you can speak a language without studying grammar, without formal grammar. But, let's take another situation. Let's say you know in your head all the grammar, you know all the rules of grammar, you know that book back to front, get all the exercises right, you know all the grammar. But you can't understand what people say very well, and your accent is very bad, and you can't speak, and people can't understand you, and you're too shy anyway to speak because you've got psychological problems. Then you know all the grammar, but you can't speak the language. So I think those are 2 little thoughts to remember about grammar, to put it in its place. I find it hard to say things like I like grammar and love grammar, because I don't personally have that sort of relationship to it. But if you talk about language, then I can, yeah, that makes more sense. And grammar is such a essential bit of language. But it's enabling, and it's lovely for that reason. And it's a pity that it's characterised in this negative way, and that so many learners either are turned off by it, some are turned off and didn't like it, and others are obsessed by it, too much. And really both attitudes are unfortunate. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.